Hi, this is Roger, thanks for dropping by. Today I'm going to take advantage of the bright light because it's good for filming, and I've actually got to water my mounts today, which means some of the things I want to film have got to be got down anyway. We did a video a while back on the Dendrobium nobili types, and this video really is going to be about the rest, the ones that aren't nobili types, and the fact that I split them up into sets based on how my winter will be for them. Other people may do things differently depending on their winter, and what I mean by your own winter is your minimum temperature and how much it increases for your daytime temperatures. What also comes into it to a degree is what part of the world you're in, which dictates your day length for your winter. Yeah, because some winters in some parts of the world don't get the really short day lengths like we get in the UK, and some parts of the world have even shorter day lengths. So that's a major factor, quite honestly, unless you use lights, yeah, where you maintain an equilibrium with your day length through artificial lighting. So all these factors come into it, a lot of which I haven't got. So I can't cater for everybody. I'm just going to say what I do and why. That's the easiest way. Then you can make adjustments. Like I say, if your day lengths don't get as short as mine, then you might not have to adjust things in such a dramatic way. Same with your temperatures. You know, some of your plants may carry on growing through your winter because you don't get the drop in temperatures. So those are the sort of variables we're coming up against, and that's why I divide mine up into sets. And the sets basically are the true winter resters, these that need the rest period to bloom. They don't need it to grow, to live, they need it to bloom. Yeah. So if you don't rest those or can't do it as well as they would like, you probably won't get such good bloomings, and in some cases you may not get any blooms. They may just refuse to bloom. I mean, if you think about it, there's other plants that refuse to bloom for various reasons. Some cattleyas and lalias, if they don't get the bright light, they just won't bloom. They'll grow great and produce lovely new growths and lovely shiny leaves, but they just won't bloom. That's a light factor, yeah. With others it's temperature, yeah. So with some it's a rest period. So all these variables come into, it's why all the orchids aren't the same. The only way you can have them all the same is to have all the same orchids, and those that are so close to the ones you've got that the difference doesn't matter. Then you can just do the same thing for everything. For me, that would just be tedious and boring. I like the variables. I like having to think about the variables. It's hence the varied collection. And my collection is not anywhere near as varied as some people. But anyway, my three sets: true resters, those that need the rest. Yeah, where they come from, they get it, and they've evolved to actually need that rest to induce the budding and the subsequent blooming. And without it, to one degree or another, the blooms will either not be there or not be as good. Yeah, so that's that set. There's another set that are called drier in winter, and that for me is everything else, believe it or not. That's what I have to do. There are some in here that would be classed as ease off a bit in winter, but not a true drier in winter set. And they come from places that don't get that cold. They have a wet season and a dry season, but even in that drier season, they've still got pretty good temperatures and humidity and some rain. So the plants in the wild would carry on growing. A bit slower maybe, but they wouldn't stop because they've got the ingredients they need to continue. Now I've got some of those, but I can't do that because my winter temperatures are going to drop down below what they would like, and my day lengths are going to reduce down. So those types will stop growing, and because they stop growing, they have to go into the drier in winter set, considerably drier in winter set, or the roots will rot. Yeah, so those are my 3 sets, and we'll have a look at examples in each of them. I probably won't be able to film everything, but I'm going to make a big dent in it. Right, and it will be done in sections as I'm watering and as things come down to look at. Right, let's get going. Right, this first group are the ones that I've still got in the black hair type, and that includes some recent replacements or introductions because some have gone out the door. This one is hanging on by the skin of its teeth, and the only reason it's still here is because it has got a good new growth. It still has scale, but that new bug spray that I got from Burnham's, it's been sprayed with that. And I'm not saying I can guarantee it's working, but I don't see things getting any worse. And bearing in mind I didn't remove any bodies, it may well have worked. But this particular group of orchids is very sensitive to systemic sprays, both fungicides and pesticides. And I would suggest they ought to be avoided if at all possible, but be it on your own heads. I mean, I had one that wasn't a bad plant. It got scale rather bad, and it had some funny marks on the leaves. So first of all, it got sprayed with a systemic fungicide, and the leaves were not happy. At a point in the future, it got sprayed with a systemic pesticide, and it dumped its leaves, literally. Within a quite short space of time, it dumped its leaves. So I would suggest that these are more sensitive than others. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to go over names, I'll do pop-ups, but this is relatively recent, and it was a relatively small plant, but it's grown that new cane this year. Some of the black hair types, it's very difficult to see why they're called that, because often the black hairs are only really apparent when the canes are quite new, shall we say. I won't say young, but quite new. This one's put on some nice roots. It's actually Coriniferum, so a species, a mounted one, so you can go back out the way now. And strangely enough, Dendrobium senile is actually classed, it's in the same Dendrobium section as the black hair types, even though the hairs on this are, well, they're nearly white, a pale grey. But it's actually in the same classification. It does have hairy canes, that's just it. Now, some writings and scrolls and ancient, history classes this as needing a good winter rest. I personally don't believe that, on the grounds that ever since I've had one, it's usually pushing new growths out into the winter, and if I rested it, those growths would stall and fail. So I keep mine going through the winter. Drier in winter, so not as frequent, but it still gets some water and it still gets a bit of feed. I don't class that as a rester. So we've got a couple of the larger species types here. We've got Formosum and the new one from Burnham's in Fundibulum. They are similar, but the blooms are different enough for me to, warrant having both. And this one here, I've forgotten. So this type, under normal circumstances, would slow down a bit in winter, more so if the days are shorter, less so if they're not so short, and a lot more so if the temperatures are going to drop down. So for me, the combination of short days and lower temperatures means these will virtually stop dead for a couple of months, from into November right through till sort of sometime in February, when the temperatures start to climb and the day lengths come back a bit. But during that other period, they're going to do very little. And if the roots are kept wet during that period, they will rot. So these have to go right dry. For me, in my, in the way I'm growing, they have to dry right out and stay dry for a bit and then get a trickle. Because if I water them like I do in the growing season by pouring water all over them, it'll probably take a month to dry. And in that time, the roots will rot. So these are what I call continuous growers that can't because of my lower temperatures and short days, otherwise they would. Yeah, so that's that set. Right, this next group, two types in here, yeah, two sort of categories. We've got Loria types, and I've got the Dendrobium phalaenopsis types, one of which is currently in bloom. And both of these are treated exactly the same as the black hair type for exactly the same reason. If I could keep them warmer and raise my minimum temperatures and keep my day length reasonable, these would carry on growing. A little slower to accommodate what they would class as a drier season, but it's not a dry season, and they would keep growing given those circumstances. The fact that they can't, because I'm effectively restricting them, again, they've got to dry right off and not be soggy in any shape or form. I lost quite a few Loria types getting that wrong. And it was just half the information was used and the other half didn't get thought about. I classed them as continuous growers and failed to appreciate the effect that the shorter days and the cooler temperatures would have on them. So basically they stayed wet too long and the roots went down. Yeah, so looking back on it, I sort of think, what an idiot, how come you got that wrong? Well, I did, and I don't anymore. So both of these like to stay warmer, yeah, and they wouldn't be subject to short days in the natural world, so they would grow. I have to stop them doing that. Well, they stop doing it naturally. I have to stop trying to force them by watering and feeding them. So that gets cut right down for these. Yeah. So, but they grow in a very, very similar way. All three, the Loria types, the phalaenopsis types, and the black hair types, they are all incredibly similar for everything really. Temperature ranges, humidity requirements, light requirements, not strong light. The phalaenopsis types can take a bit more light than the others. I'm not saying they need it, but they can take it. But apart from that, their care is incredibly similar. So you're venturing out into different types. You think, oh, I could try a Loria type. Well, if you're growing Dendrobium phalaenopsis types, and they're okay, then yes, you can grow Loria types, and you could have a go at the black hair types. They all come together, care-wise. So that's that little group then. Same logic, same care. Now these two, as far as I'm concerned, come as a pair. They've just got so many similarities apart from their size that they could almost be the same plant. But basically we've got Dendrobium Lindleyi and Dendrobium jenkinsii. Jenkinsii tends to grow flatter, typified by this section over here. You see how the pseudobulbs lay flat and creep outwards from the centre. Yeah, and there's very few of them pointing directly away. They've got that flat appearance. Single leaf and crinkly canes, basically. That is their natural look. Now that needs a rest to get a good blooming out of it, and if it's rested too hard, and by that I mean humidity a bit lower than perhaps it should be and water withheld a bit more than it should be, these will shrivel badly. And they'll get to the point where they've shriveled so much, it doesn't matter how much water you give them in the following year, they will not plump up. Yeah? So you've got to go careful with this rest thing. It is no feed, very little water. But the amount of water they get will depend on the low temperature, the day length, and how bright the light is. Now we're on to the resting type, the light comes in, because they need bright light for their resting period. Yeah? And I mean bright light. Mine lives in a place where when the sun is out, it gets it. So although it's through a layer of shade netting, it's in the brightest light I can get. And That's not how they're looked after in the summer. They don't need that bright light in the summer. In the growing season, they can put up with a fair bit less light and they'll grow happily. This one is not resting yet because, bless its little cotton socks, it's decided to throw out some new growths. It's only a couple, but it is currently pushing out some new growths. So I'm just going to help that along. In theory, those new growths would not drain the plant if I started the rest now. But delaying it a week or so is no big deal, just to let those leaves open up. Now the Lindleyi was quite a new plant and I didn't expect it to bloom, but nonetheless it did. This has been grown on from a seedling. You can see the tiny little pseudobulbs there. I've produced some good, strong, fat canes this year, so I suspect we will have another good blooming on that. The thing I'm looking forward to finding out is, will it bloom on canes that bloomed this year? Will it bloom again on the same canes, or is it along the lines, some dendrobiums, they bloom on a cane, they will never bloom again on that cane, so they have to grow new growths. This one produces less blooms and the spikes are not as long, but it does make up for it in, in the amount of spikes given the number of canes. So, that's the thing. If you want to count the canes on there, there's rather a lot. If you count the canes on here, there's nowhere near as many. If I can grow as many canes on this plant as there are on there, I'll probably have one of the best ones there is in the world. But it's grown nicely this year, it's produced some good roots, and it's pushed up some really strong canes. Both of those will get a full rest. Yeah. This one bloomed this year without a full rest. And that's why I said I didn't expect it to bloom, but it did. It bloomed late. But spring bloomers, spring towards summer, really. They're not early spring bloomers, these two. They do wait for those day lengths to come right back in. So that's those two. True winter resters, those two. Now this is my Hercoglossum. And when I first got this, I was under the impression that it would grow canes in the growing season, and then would stop growing through the winter period, and then start some new canes again the next year. And I didn't know what happened to the canes I already had. I had to have it for several years before I worked out how this one grows. So if we start from a new growth that starts at the beginning of the growing season, these are they, yeah? So this is this year's growth up here. It's still growing. We're into November. And this is the bit I didn't know. These new growths will carry on growing through the winter. They will carry on growing through the next growing season as well. And then during the following winter, they may get a terminal leaf and stop. By then they'll be quite long, they'll have gained the weight, and they'll have sunk down here, like these have. So all these ones near the top, all these up here are this year's growth, including some that have escaped round the back. So that's this year's growth. This lot down here are last year's growth in the main. No, they haven't finished growing, have they? This is the bit that took me a while to work out what was going on. Yeah? And then round the back are the 3-year-old canes. Most of those are leafless. So you've got 1 year's growth through the winter, carry on growing through the second growing season, still with all their leaves, and then they go into their second winter. And sometime after that, they start to drop leaves. Yeah? And canes will bloom over several seasons, and sometimes they'll bloom out of season. I get a mad flush of blooms on this, a mass blooming, but I may get a couple of forerunners, a couple of buds that just open early on their own before the mad rush sort of thing, and then later in the year I'll get some more, just the odd little spray of blooms out of season, so it can pop blooms out at various times. But this one, because it carries on growing through the winter, there's no way that's getting any sort of rest whatsoever. I just carry on exactly as I have through the growing season. The frequency that it gets fed and water comes down because of the short day lengths and the lower temperatures, but it doesn't stop growing. Yeah, so canes from their start, at the start of the growing season, grow through season 1, through winter 1, through season 2, right into winter 2, and some are even still growing at the start of season 3. That's why the canes get so long. And a lot of other people's plants I've seen have got much shorter canes. And when you sort of say, how do you treat that in the winter? Oh, I give that a rest in the winter. And that's why their canes aren't very big. If allowed to do so, the canes will grow long. And, you know, this is the sort of length they can achieve. So this is going to have a tidy up. As we get towards the end of the winter, a lot of these older canes aren't going to bloom anymore. They've bloomed probably 3 seasons worth of blooms now, and they make the back of the plant look really untidy. And we've got so many new growths this year and last year that let's have the nice leaved canes and a good blooming. So that's an odd one. So that gets treated really differently to anything else I've got because of the way it grows. I haven't got anything else that grows like that in the dendrobium world that can carry on growing into the 3rd season. Yeah. So yeah, good one, and an unusual one for me. And that's not what I read about this and the instructions when I first got it, and not what I do. How I treat this has evolved by watching it grow and seeing if and when it stops growing and when it starts to drop its leaves and all that sort of thing. So I had to observe this for a while, and now it's just a regular thing. It just, you know, goes along with the flow. So that's an odd one. Right, so this is another monster, Dendrobium chryseum, and quite honestly, whatever I say about this, I wouldn't take any notice if I was you, because I can't get this to bloom. And I think what it is that this does, I'll have to re-verify this before I try the experiment, but I've just got a niggle that somewhere I read that this one really does chill down in the winter in its natural world. You know, literally down to sort of 7, 8, 9 degrees, something like that. Now, if that's true, and that triggers the blooms, that will explain why it isn't blooming. Yeah? Because it's had long enough now, and it's certainly grown enough, you know. It's a massive plant. New growth up here, older growths down here, but still no blooms. So I'm still wondering about this one. But the experiment I'm going to try, if I can sort of find out emphatically that this one does chill right down, a lot lower than in my grow room, then what I will do when we get to the towards the end of winter, I'm going to start putting it outside where it gets cooler temperatures. I'll have to watch for, well, there won't be bugs around because it'll be winter time, but I'll have to watch for slugs and snails getting at it. But it's the only way I can get the temperatures down lower is to get some outside air on it and see if that will do it. I'd only have to do it over a period of a few weeks. I don't need to do it for the whole winter. The plant will trigger those low temperatures and then everything will perhaps kick into gear. So again, it's another one that pushes up a shed load of new growth and grows well right through the season, and some of the canes continue on growing into the winter time, and some of them get a terminal leaf. They do vary. Now this one is suffering a bit at the moment. I know why. Because my frequency of watering has been reduced because of the shorter days and the cooler temperatures, this one's in the same frequency as the others, and it's not pushing its new leaves out properly. There's a little bit of crinkling going on. They do correct themselves, but this one really could do with watering more often. It's a beast of a plant. But anyway, as yet a non-bloomer, but basically towards the end of this winter I'm going to work on it, and if I still can't get it to bloom, then it might have to be, somebody else might have to have a go at it, because I've had it quite a while now and there's still no sign of, you know, if I got a smattering of blooms I'd be happy, but nothing, not a light. So We'll see. And like they say, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, you will get the same results. So I need to change something, which is choice of two, really. Either keep it warmer in the winter, which is difficult, or keep it cooler in winter, which is impossible. But outside may come to the rescue. We shall see. And staying with the true winter resters, this is Dendrobium aphyllum. It's only grown one cane this year, although it does have a kiki pushing on. But it's only grown one cane this year. It's a good sized cane. It's longer than anything it's produced before, and I think that has just literally finished growing now. Just. So that can go into its rest now. It won't get totally dried off for really long periods, and this one's a strange one because although it's a winter rester, its low temperature is not as cool as some of the others. So it does get a drier period where it comes from, but not the low temperatures. So it's a form of rest. You've still got to knock the feed off. You know, it's not growing, it's stopped growing, and it doesn't need much water, it's stopped growing, yeah? But sometime during the winter this will start dropping leaves, and once it starts it really takes off and the leaves start dropping like flies. Not all overnight. If all your leaves come off in one night, something's gone wrong. But over a relatively short period they will turn yellow and fall off, and by the time we get to blooming there won't be any leaves left, or very few. Sometimes there's an odd couple. Now I've put this one up here because everybody forgets I've got this. I did have Primulinum. Primulinum and aphyllum are very, very similar. The Primulinum went to INSA because I got this one at Malvern last year, which is the Primulinum variety Laos, and it's the one that has the deep gold in the throat. Now this is not a big plant. It needs to get bigger than this. I may not get any blooms this spring, but I have grown two nice canes, although they're not as long as it can be. Canes on this I may be under the impression that it should grow the same size as the normal Primulinum, when in fact this variety may have shorter canes. I don't know. Haven't had it long enough. If I get any blooms I'll be over the moon, but I may not. But it's got some good roots, you know, it's taken to its mount, and it's grown two nice canes, both of which have completely finished growing. Perfect example of terminal leaves. Sticking almost straight up from the top of the cane and smaller. That's what terminal leaves look like under normal circumstances. So that's two of the true winter resters. And again, they're going into their rest now. The watering frequency for all my mounts has already reduced down. 2 to 3 days now, depending on the amount of sunshine. We've just had 2 sunny days on the trot, so they need watering. If we'd had 3 dull days, they'd get watered on the 3rd day. And when we get into the depths of winter, that will probably go to 4 days, even though some of them are growing. They'll slow down. The cooler temperatures, shorter days and dull weather, they'll just slow down. So they won't need as much feed and water. So no more feed for these, and their rest is quite easy to accommodate at the moment. If I'm watering every 2 to 3 days, yeah, I've still got plants growing and producing blooms. They'll need some feed, yeah? You know, it's not going to produce that lot without some feed. So on one of my waterings there'll be some feed. Well, during that session these won't get anything. They'll get missed out. So they'll go twice as long before they get considered again. And that's part of how I reduce the watering down, because some of my other mounts do still need feeding, whereas these don't. So I just miss them out on that run. It means watering the mounts gets a bit quicker if I'm missing some out. So that's those two, very similar. I'm going to have to go careful putting some of these plants on that fan to film them. I'm going to pull it off the wall. This is heavy, this plant. It's a lot of plant and a big mount. And that's before I've watered it, but it is a heavy plant. One bent cane. Guess why? Touched the roof. Yeah. unnoticed by me. Now this is one that grows a little similar to the Hercoglossum, but not quite as, it doesn't prolong its cane growth as long as the Hercoglossum. But up here we've got this year's new growths. They're obviously still growing, and they will carry on growing through the winter. Yeah, but they will stop next year, relatively early on. Now the older canes down here, during this winter, will probably throw their leaves. Yeah, they've already dropped a fair few. They will probably drop the rest of them. But what we're looking at here is canes that have already bloomed. This was the blooming this year. The canes round the back there are never going to bloom again and need thinning out. They really do need thinning out this time. So what we're looking at is the possibility of a few more blooms on these canes. Yeah, like this one didn't bloom at all, but that's not of this year's growth, but that didn't bloom, so it was a late growth. So that will pull in next year. That will produce blooms next year, as will all of this lot. And most of these upright canes will carry on growing and keel over and arch downwards over the top of these. Yeah, and then gradually they work backwards through the seasons until they are dead old shrivel canes hanging out the back, which can then be trimmed off. Yeah, this one grows well for me. It's classed as a winter rester, but bearing in mind it blooms in June, you have to ask yourself, what the hell is the rest in January and February got to do with buds that don't even form until May? But I'm not going to risk not resting it in case it doesn't bloom. It blooms well for me. So, you know, this is one of those, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So this will get exactly the same treatment as it's always had because it grows well and it blooms well. But it does grow a little differently. It's not an annually deciduous plant, it's a semi-deciduous plant. Drops its leaves after 2 years rather than after 1 year. The previous two that we looked at, the Aphyllum, that drops its leaves every year. It's annually deciduous. And under normal circumstances, that's a true giveaway for a true rester. If it drops its leaves every year, there's a reason. And the reason is the conditions aren't good enough to sustain growth through that period. So it dumps its leaves like trees do. Yeah? Deciduous forests, they can't support that leaf growth and cover through the harsher times. So they dump their leaves, they reabsorb the goodness, dump their leaves and put on a fresh growth in the spring. And that's what some of the annually deciduous orchids are mimicking. Yeah. So anyway, this is a biggie. It does get a rest, but it doesn't get the complete rest like the others do because it's still growing. So this one gets some feed, a little bit different to the Aphyllum and the Primulinum that have completely finished growing. This one hasn't. So if it's still growing, it needs some help. Now this is a strange one that I haven't had long. This was taken out of a pot and mounted, and it objected. For a while, not for long, but it objected. And it objected on these long canes here. So this is the point where it was mounted. And yes, it carried on growing, but the energy wasn't there because of the lack of roots or the root disturbance. And then it picked up again and started growing properly again. Same over here. Yeah, some weak distorted leaves followed by proper leaves again. And the most important thing about this is I haven't had it long, so I need to see what it's going to do. And to me, it's pretty obvious what it's going to do. It's growing. And more importantly than these ridiculously long older canes that we did get some blooms on, is this lot up here. These are brand new canes. It's growing. So now that may be because of when I got it and its disturbance, that it's actually putting on these growths later in the season than it will do next year. Nonetheless, I've got 3 good strong canes up here that are in active growth, a few more starting, and the longest canes on here that were on it when I got it are still growing as well. Yeah? So these are last year's new growths effectively. that carried on growing through this year and bloomed, and those are this year's that are going to carry on growing again. So I think those will carry on growing through next year as well. So this is a new one, so I'm watching it, but it's certainly not going to get rested. It'll get the lower temperatures and the shorter days, it's got no choice. But as far as feed and watering is concerned, this is in active growth. These are brand new canes pushing on here. There's no way I want to slow those down. So this will get fed and watered with the Oncidium types that are mounted, because it's growing, so treated differently yet again. And the last one of the true resters that I'm going to film anyway, this is Dendrobium nesta. It's an anosmum hybrid basically. It is classed as an annually deciduous plant, and just to make me a liar, it didn't drop all its leaves last winter. This is the cane that bloomed earlier this year, and it didn't drop all of its leaves. So a strange one. Good strong new cane this year, but only one. Now, this plant should be gaining enough strength to produce more than one cane every now and again, even if it's only every other year, but it didn't. But what did happen this year is it got munched. Something got at this point here, and munched that leaf, and munched that leaf, and a bit of that one. And then it carried on growing, and it still is. So although this is a winter resting dendrobium, this cane is still active. It's still got at least one more leaf to produce. Now there's enough backup here for that to complete its growth without any more feed or water. But as I'm going round, I just as well carry on and give it the help to complete that cane and get it as large as it can be before it does actually trigger the stop. Helped along by shorter days and cooler temperatures. So that will be its last leaf, I'm sure. And then during the winter, a lot of those will fall. But unlike last year, we don't know whether they're all going to fall this time round. So anyway, this grew quite a few new roots this year, but this needs remounting. Although it's a horrible thing to tear one off a mount, it's not. The mount is old and tired. And it's starting, what happens with cork bark when you get a mound of roots like that with old moss underneath, it starts to degrade and starts to crumble and produce like a dusty, almost like soil, where it starts to break down. And at that point the roots don't like it. So if the roots can get to a bit that's still okay, like that, they'll be happy. But otherwise they often fail. So that needs a remount. And the time to do it? When do we repot or remount orchids? When we see new roots growing. That ain't going to be for some time. So it's going to have to go through winter, into next year, and probably out the other end of blooming before the new growths and the new roots come, at which point it will get remounted next time round. So that's what happened with the Hercoglossum. That stopped growing on its mount. It wasn't happy. So I tore it off and actually mounted it round. I just turned the mount round the other way and mounted it again on the back. And since then it's doubled its root size. So even on a mount, roots can object and not be happy. And even cork bark can break down eventually. I've had this plant a long time and it's been on that mount since I got it. This cork is underneath here is starting to go. So that will have to be dealt with next year. Nonetheless, an annually deciduous plant based on its anosmum parent. I've forgotten what the other parent is. I can't remember. But yeah, so an anosmum cross, annually deciduous, needs a proper rest. Oh, I just had a marvellous thought. I was just starting to put these back up there. Now that rack there is always watered last. Well, it doesn't mean to say it has to be watered last. They're all down at the moment. Let's water them now and then put them back up there. Otherwise I'm going to put them back up and get them down again in a minute. That's not the normal sequence. I have a sequence, and by sticking to a watering sequence, nothing ever gets forgotten. It's a routine that requires zero thought. Just, it's one of those you could do it like a robot, you just do it. Starting to change the order, it's easy to forget things, but as all the big stuff's down at the moment, I'll mix up my well, I'll go and have a look at my notes. I can't remember whether it's a feed run or a flush run, but whichever it is, get that sorted, get these done, get those back up, and I'll probably just do the plants in reverse today. That's, you know, no big deal. So any Dendrobiums I haven't filmed still come into one of those three sets. You've got the full resters, annually deciduous. Those that are still resters that are not annually deciduous, like the ones I've mentioned. So I've got in my head now, I need to get on with my water, and it's getting hot in here and all the kit's been turned off. And we've got those that grow on through the winter but nonetheless slow down. And then we've got those that would carry on growing quite well if the temperature didn't drop. And because the day length dropped down, it affects everything. Yeah. And the most important thing for me is those that need the brighter, drier rest get the light. And why do they get the light? Because they live next to the glass. Or, like there, they live on that side of that rack. So the Lindleyi is there, my Loria is there, there's some Cattleyas there as well. That shelf, that rack, when hung low down here, gets bright light, very bright light. This rack here gets the brightest light as well. So, you know, a lot of the winter resting stuff goes there. Other Dendrobiums are splattered around all over the place. Again, this rack here, right up next to the roof, good light. Nothing in the way, no plants shading these, yeah? But the ones round this side get less light than the ones round this side, yeah? And one that was put up probably without concentrating, pressed right up against the roof on a warm day. That's a nobly, we've done that. But that's the difference in the light. The Tolumnias get the best light on this rack. They face the brightest light. The ones round here don't get so much. Why don't they get so much? Well, in a couple of cases, because I haven't moved them to their winter quarters yet, there's two nobly types up there. They need to get some light. Certainly that one up there is in a although it's near the roof, it's relatively shaded there because of the other plants. Yeah. And then there'll be some Dendrobiums I haven't filmed that are just what I call also rans, which naturally come into the drier in winter, but not dry for long periods because they are still attempting to grow a bit. Things like this Kaneko up here. This will carry on slowly growing. You know, it's even starting some new growths through the winter. And it will probably push some more blooms out soon. So that will need a bit of help. So that's the then some of the Dendrobiums I've got. Quite a lot of them actually. Minus the noblies because we did that as a separate video. So, you know, and I did those separately because it's, in most cases with people that are starting collections up, they've started with some Phalaenopsis perhaps, they may have ventured into some Oncidium intergenerics and perhaps trying a Cattleya or two, and their first Dendrobium, 9 times out of 10, will be a nobly type in full bloom, and they get it home and think, what the hell am I going to do with that once the blooms fall off? Yeah. So I did those separately because it's the one most people have got. Now, I didn't film this one today even though it's in full bloom, but you know, effectively we are looking at a Loria type here. Yeah, it's my only one in bloom at the moment, Alexandrei. So there we go, that's a look round and a chat about some of the Dendrobiums and the fact that although it's coming into winter, some of them will continue to grow, and if they're going to grow they'll need help. Some of them will stop growing because of the conditions they're in, whereas in your conditions they might not stop growing. Yeah, so don't do as I say or as I do. Think about the conditions. My minimum winter temperature this year is going to be 14. I've set my thermostat at 15 with a differential of 1, which means it'll drop down to 14, kick in the heater and the big fan to take it up to 15 and then shut down. So my nighttime temperatures will hover between 14 and 15 degrees C. Last year it was cooler than that and some other plants suffered. So I'm trying to balance it this year. I still want my winter resters to bloom, but I don't want some of the other plants to suffer as badly as they did last year with the low temps. So a little bit of adjustment for this year, and the light has already been adjusted. This time of year in the UK, it might seem like a bright sunny day, but in reality that light is nowhere near as bright as it would be in the tropics. Nowhere near it, and for much less time. Yeah, so and I got a big tree that's going to shut that light out in a minute, so there we go. Right, so dendrobium thing, and let's get on and water them now, or water and feed, whichever it is, I've forgotten. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for dropping by.